In this video, I want to try and refute 6 of the best arguments put forward by atheists, agnostics, and other skeptics against the biblical witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The first objection is this: Jesus never existed and he's just a myth.
Christianity, at the end of the day, with no proof, everything is mythology.
In my book, I say that there's no reason at all to believe that the so-called Jesus of Nazareth ever existed.
Critical scholars, not evangelical people who read the New Testament, but critical scholars say that Jesus of the New Testament did not exist and could not have existed.
Can you do you have a box of evidence that you can pull out that points to the undeniable conclusion that that's true? Because if you don't, then it's a myth.
There's actually really good evidence for the historical existence of Jesus Christ. Take, for example, the writings of Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian who lived between 56 and 120 AD. He was the proconsul of Rome, the second highest position under the emperor, and he wrote a history of Rome titled The Annals of Imperial Rome, using official records from the Roman Empire. And he says this in his book, The Annals of Imperial Rome. He says, Nero inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procreators, Pontius Pilate. The extreme penalty in the Roman Empire was crucifixion. So we can see here that the proconsul of Rome, the second highest in the Roman Empire under the emperor himself, says that Jesus not only existed, but that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, just as the Bible says, and that his followers had spread the gospel all the way to Rome by the time of the Emperor Nero. Not only that, we have the writings of the Roman historian Suetonius. Suetonius was another ancient Roman historian, and he records riots among the Jews in Rome over a man named Christus during the reign of Emperor Claudius around 45 AD, 20 years before Nero. He says this: because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from the city. Now, we actually have some fascinating archaeological evidence that supports the fact that the Emperor Claudius knew that the resurrection of Jesus was being proclaimed throughout the Roman Empire. If you go to the Louvre Museum in Paris, you'll find there a marble slab dated to about 49 AD, and this marble slab was actually found in Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus, the town where Jesus grew up. And on this marble slab, there is a decree from the Emperor Claudius prescribing the death penalty for anybody who interferes with or removes bodies from tombs. Now, the fascinating thing is this: the town of Nazareth was a town of about 500 people. And usually throughout the Roman Empire, the punishment for interfering with or removing bodies from tombs was a fine. But here we have a decree from the Roman Emperor Claudius himself in a town of 500 people prescribing the death penalty for anybody who removes bodies or interferes with a body in a tomb. Why is that? I think the Emperor Claudius knew that the riots taking place in Rome during his reign were because of the proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ taking place there. In addition to this, we have the Jewish Talmud, and the Jews were the enemies of the Christians. They persecuted the Christians. They mentioned Jesus, and they mentioned some fascinating things that took place at the temple when Jesus was crucified. Listen to this. The Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, it says this: Jesus was hanged on Passover Eve. 40 days previously, the herald had cried, "He is being let out for stoning because he has practiced sorcery and led Israel astray and enticed them into apostasy. Whosoever has anything to say in his defense, let him come and declare it. As nothing was brought forward in his defense, he was hanged on Passover Eve." Notice that the Jewish Talmud doesn't deny the miracles of Jesus. Instead, the Jewish Talmud says that Jesus was practicing sorcery. They all knew that the miracles were real. They had to find a way to explain it away, and so they said that Jesus was practicing sorcery. Notice as well that it says that he was killed on the eve of Passover, confirming what it says in the New Testament and confirming the theological reasons why Christians say that Jesus was crucified. He was crucified as our Passover lamb. And when you read other parts of the Talmud, you'll find that the Jews, they were shutting the doors of the temple after Jesus was crucified, but the doors kept on flinging open. This is in the Jewish Talmud, and it says that the Jews were very afraid because the temple was speaking to them, it says, and the doors were continually being flung open. This shows that the way into the most holy of holies had been made, and no matter how many times the Jews tried to shut the door would remain open because Christ had made the way for everyone to come directly to God. Let me give you another historical reference. This is from Josephus. The Jewish historian Josephus says this: "At this time there was a wise man called Jesus. His conduct was good and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." So when we look at the historical evidence, we can see that not only did Jesus exist, but that according to the testimony of his enemies, the Jews, he was a miracle worker. He was also crucified under Pontius Pilate, just as the Bible says. The tomb was empty, and that's why the Emperor Claudius was issuing death threats to anyone who is interfering with bodies in tombs or removing bodies from tombs. But we can also see that the early church had proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus from Nazareth all the way to Rome by at least 49 AD. Pretty fascinating evidence for somebody that's just a myth. So what's the next objection that people make? Well, sometimes these atheists and agnostics and other skeptics say that the disciples stole the body. This has to be one of the dumbest explanations I've ever heard.
We are going to steal his body. Okay, I'm tracking with you. What's next? And then we're going to tell the whole world that he rose from the dead.
Oh, you know I'm in.
I love it already.
All right, classic. Then what?
And then we're all going to get brutally murdered.
The Roman Empire was extremely effective at crushing rebellions and messianic movements and other forms of dissent, and they would do so by publicly executing in the most cruel fashion crucifixion the leaders of these movements. And that's what they did with Jesus. The idea that these disciples would steal the body and proclaim the resurrection is absolutely mind-blowingly stupid. Why would they risk their lives for something that they know was a lie? Another really popular objection is that the death and resurrection of Jesus is just a copy of ancient myths about dying and rising gods. But Dr. Gary Habermas from Liberty University has shut this down completely. He's even shut it down on live TV in a debate.
Let's take Adonis. Adonis is probably the ancient god for which we have the clearest data that he was raised from the dead. We have 4 accounts that Adonis was raised. The earliest one is the 2nd century AD. The other ones are between the 2nd and 4th century AD. The earliest account we have for Attis is the 3rd century AD. And while Isis and Osiris as a religion was definitely pre-Christian, there is no resurrection in Isis and Osiris. Osiris in particular is not raised.
The next objection is kind of strange. It comes from Christopher Hitchens. He says that the resurrection must be false because the first witnesses were women. Listen to this.
About the resurrection, most of the witnesses to this are women, illiterate, stupid, deluded, hysterical females, of the kind who in a Jewish court at that time would have had about as much chance of being listened to as they would in an Islamic court today.
Now, Christopher Hitchens is partly correct. A woman's testimony back then was considered to be extremely unreliable. But that only proves the authenticity of the New Testament. All 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, record women as being the first witnesses to the resurrection, proving that the authors of the Gospel were not trying to convince anybody. They were simply presenting the facts as they were. And we know today that a woman's testimony is just as good as a man's. Now, the next objection is that the disciples must have been having some kind of hallucination. But this is unrealistic as well. First of all, it's very difficult to believe that all these disciples were having the same hallucination. Secondly, if they were going to have any kind of hallucination, it would be a paranoid one that Roman soldiers and the Jews were coming to kill them as well. Thirdly, psychologists have pointed out that those who have hallucinations are generally people with mental illnesses, people on drugs, or people experiencing extreme bodily deprivation. None of those descriptions fit the authors of the New Testament. And finally, why didn't they go and look at the tomb for themselves? If they were hallucinating, surely they could have gone down to the tomb to see whether the body was there or not. Or better yet, why didn't the Jews bring out the body, proving to everybody that Jesus didn't rise from the dead and bringing a swift end to Christianity right at the beginning? But of course, none of that happened. In fact, the opposite happened. The Emperor Claudius was threatening people with the death penalty for interfering with bodies in tombs. Clearly, the body was not there. Now, the last and final objection, I think personally, is probably the most common objection. It goes like this. I don't know what happened, but whatever happened, it couldn't have been a resurrection because that would require a miracle. And since miracles don't happen, there couldn't have been a resurrection. But that kind of thinking requires a naturalistic worldview. That is, you have to believe that there's no such thing as a God. And I find that extremely unrealistic. When I look at the sky, I go outside and I look up at the sky and I look at the trees and I see the birds and I see the sun shining and I think about the fact that we are on a planet that is flying through space with all sorts of dangers around us, and yet we are perfectly safe. I cannot help but think that there is a God. When I look at creation, I just cannot help but think that there is a God that created it all. And to say that there is not a God is to say that everything came from nothing. Have you ever asked yourself the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we have a universe at all? From nothing, nothing comes. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and the best explanation for the cause of the universe is God. That is the best explanation. And so when we approach the historical evidence with that framework in mind, that there is a God, it becomes very clear that the best explanation for the historical evidence is that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. The skeptics' arguments have been demolished. I hope you've liked this video. If you have, please consider subscribing. Give me a thumbs up, hit the bell notification button. I'll see you in the comments section and you'll see me in my next video.